Today is Tuesday, June 10th, 2003, and this is the beginning of an interview with William R. Locke in the library at Mariemont Junior High School at 6743 Chestnut Street in Mariemont, Ohio. Mr. Locke is 78 years old, having been born on November 2nd, 1924. My name is Nancy Bisbe, a library aide at Mariemont Junior High School, and I'll be the interviewer. Mr. Locke, could you state for the recording what war and branch of service you served in?
World War II in the Army, and also the Korean War, also in the Army.
What was your rank?
When I got discharged after World War II, was a technician 5th grade called T5, and after the Korean War I got discharged, I was a staff sergeant.
And where did you serve?
World War II in Europe, called ETO, European Theater of Operations. The Korean War, Fort Leonard Wood.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
Drafted.
And when was that?
Drafted in June or July of 1943.
Where were you living at the time?
Newport, Kentucky.
And how old were you?
18.
Did you have a choice of which branch of the service when you're drafted?
You had the choice of the Navy or the Army. Usually not the Marine Corps. The reason I took the Army because the Army was giving you 3 weeks from the time you were inducted until you went to active duty. The Navy, I think, gave you 2 weeks. And besides, I couldn't swim, and I didn't want to go in the Navy.
Okay. What were you doing at the time?
I was a high school student.
And had you just graduated?
Just graduated.
And then how soon after graduation were you taken away to basic training?
I think that after graduation it was something like a month. I was inducted, and when they got through all the processing and things like that, I believe it was active duty was August the 6th, 1943.
Where did you go for training?
Camp Bartley, Texas.
Do you remember those days? Can you recall anything about your basic training?
We just had the basic training, marches and close order drill and things of that sort. And then they assigned some of the people to various things outside of basic training, like cooks and bakers school, mechanic school, truck driver school, or to be a medic, which meant that you would treat the wounded in combat, or clerk, that you would do clerk work for hospitals or whatever clerking had to be done in the Army. And they sent me to Army Clerk School.
And how long was your training totally?
I think the basic training of field drilling and such as that was 3 weeks, and I think the Army Clerk School was 8 weeks, 8 or 10 weeks.
And then when you were done with your basic training, what happened next?
After basic training, we were sent to a place, some military installation in Pennsylvania, and then after 3 weeks in that facility, we were moved to they called it Camp Shanks, New York. It was outside of Nyack, New York, for about 2 or 3 weeks. They were preparing us for overseas. We boarded a ship toward the end of December. The ship, something happened to the mechanism in the ship, and they couldn't go in convoy, so they took us back to the barracks, and we stayed there over New Year's Eve, I think around January the 4th or 5th. They put us on another ship, the Mauritania, and as it got out into the harbor, a tanker ran into the ship and bent the bow plate, so we went back into the docks to have the bow plates welded, and you have a bad feeling about that time about your leaving to go overseas because all these things are happening. And finally the ship left, and we went as far north as up near the Arctic Circle because the ship was covered with ice at some mornings. And we had about 15,000 troops on board the ship and landed at Liverpool, England.
Did you have any discomfort? Were you sick at all?
Sick, so sick that you think you're going to die. And everybody, most of the people were really sick. And we slept in the mess hall, what was used as a mess hall, one night on a table, next night on a bench, and the third night on the floor, and we'd rotate these around like that. And the people were getting very sick in the mess halls. And if you weren't sick, one of the other troops came in, if you weren't sick when you came in, you'd be sick when you got in there from the smell and things like that of the people being sick.
Were you on tables because there weren't enough berths for everybody? Was it?
The Mauritania was a luxury liner in civilian life, and they just crammed the troops in any way they could. Some of the troops were on bunks about 4 or 5 high, and some of them slept in on the mess halls. Any place that there was available that they could put troops, they stuck them. That was it.
So the ship wasn't outfitted with weaponry or anything?
Oh, no, no. The only weapons they had were they had gunners on the deck that would, in case there was an attack, they could fire their whatever guns they had. And they had gunnery practice, which scared the daylights out of us because of tremendous explosions when they were practicing that.
Were you in a convoy at that point?
No, no, that ship did not leave in convoy. We heard later on it was extremely dangerous because they were going through the submarine lanes, and the Germans were trying to signal, particularly troop ships. They would like to have sunk troop ships.
Do you think that your training prepared you for what you were to face?
No.
Not at all?
No.
You told me, where exactly did you end up when you finally landed?
We landed in Liverpool, England, and from there we went to facilities outside of Birmingham, England. It was like a great big housing project, and it was similar to what you'd have here in the United States now. Almost like, well, I wouldn't call it a ghetto, but it was multi-apartment buildings, and they put the troops in these. We had bunks in the things, two-decker bunks, and we had maybe 6 men to a room, and civilians lived there before we got there. They just took the civilians out and moved the troops in, and it was called a replacement depot, and you just waited there until you were assigned to wherever you were going to go.
In the pre-interview, you told me that you had a look at your personnel file and found out something. Was that before you got on the ship?
No, that was afterwards.
And what did you find?
On the front of the personnel file was a BI, and I asked somebody, what does BI mean? So it means branch of material, which meant that they could stick you any place that they happened to have an opening, or if they needed troops in whatever organization, they would say, here's some warm bodies, you can go into that. Truck drivers, cook and baker, mechanics, infantry, engineers, whatever. Wherever they needed a human being, they would stick you in that.
Did that make you kind of nervous?
At the time, but by that time I had already been assigned, so it really didn't make me nervous. So I thought, well, that there would, for the grace of God, I could have been a BI.
Okay, so what happened next when you got to England? What was your assignment, and how did it happen?
We got to England. They put you in. There are thousands of troops there, and they go through, as the Army will usually do, go through your records and decide who's going to go where. And they called. We were there I was there about 2 weeks. And usually you didn't last in the replacement depot more than 2 or 3 weeks. And after 2 weeks, they called out about 7 or 8 names, and said you were going to an engineer regiment in near Chester, England. And the 8 of us talked and found that we had really nothing in common in our basic training, and we had no idea we had no idea what we were going to do if we got there, because none of us, I don't think, had trained in an engineering basic training group. And when we got to Chester, England, the trucks came down and picked us up and said, "You're for the regiment?" And we said, "Yes, we suppose so." And when we got out to where the troops were, it was a great large camping ground, tar paper shacks, tar paper huts, I guess they call them. A young captain came out and said, "Are you the lads for the band?" And we thought, oh boy, you know, if you're going to be in the Army, you always try to get the best deal you can. And I think everybody's idea of what a wonderful thing would be if you were in the Army to get into a band, because that's pretty cushy. At least everybody thought so. And so here we were, we got into an Army band. And the reason we got into a band, it was probably one of the most disorganized bands that ever came down the pike. Some of the men had just the minimum basic music education. They could play the horns, sort of. And the colonel of this regiment said that he had to have a band for his regiment. He was really a spit and polish colonel, and he was about 55 years old at the time, from Virginia, and spoke with a heavy Virginia accent. And he made sure that he got instruments for this band. How he got them, they stole them, they did moonlight requisitioning, however they got them. And they put this band together, and the colonel thought our band was just great, because he had the band out playing for the troops, and the troops hated the band because we always seemed to have a little bit better accommodations than they did. But it was great. The colonel thought we were wonderful, and we thought he was great too. So we were pretty happy being in the band.
I'm going to backtrack just a minute. When you said that the ship was covered with ice when you were going over, were your supplies adequate, or were you pretty cold? Were you dressed properly?
See, when you're on a troop ship, every day, for example, they'd say everybody has to go on deck from 10 to 12, or from 11 to 1, so they could clean up the place down below, and also to get the troops up there and get some fresh air. And there was ice on the railings and on the decks, and the situations were pretty bad for a troop ship, because the men were still getting sick, and there was vomit on some of the troops when they came on deck. Unfortunately, if you were standing in front of some guy that got sick, you may get the blunt of his sickness all over your clothing, and there was no way to clean it off, and there was no way to take a bath. So if you can imagine troops on a ship for took us 9 days to get overseas. The place was pretty ripe. Wasn't too clean.
That was a lot of men on the ship. Were there arguments or fighting, or did everybody pretty much get along okay?
Everybody got pretty much along, except they had some Rangers on board. And when the Rangers came in to eat, they never ate like anybody else. They put everything in a mess kit and took a spoon and stirred it all together. Jello, mashed potatoes, gravy, whatever it was. I think they were just trying to show that they were pretty tough guys. No, there were really not any fights. Everybody just took it as it came.
Okay, so you were put in the band, and you said that the other soldiers didn't like the people who were in the band. Did they abuse you with either verbally or? They
just didn't associate with us, or we didn't associate with them, because the troops would be out all day working in the fields, laying sewer pipe or drainage ditches or whatever, and the band is back there doing not much of anything. And when it came time for retreat, the colonel would be at the main gate, and the band would go marching up there in their Class A uniforms, and the colonel would say, "The boys have been out there in the field working all day. You want to give them a nice peppy march." And that didn't go over too well with the troops when they came through, because out of the corner of their mouth they were cursing the band as they went by.
Did it embarrass you, or were you happy? Really?
Oh, it didn't embarrass us. We just thought, tough luck.
So tell me what an average day was like for you then. What did you...
The average day was we got up at 5:45, and we had to play reveille in the morning, which didn't go very well with the troops either, because we went by blowing... There's nothing like having a brass band playing by your bed at 6 o'clock in the morning. They would, we'd go up and play reveille, and then we'd come back, and most of us, we didn't eat breakfast, and they would go into the barracks and write letters or take a nap until about noontime, maybe in the afternoon. We had to play for the nurses. We're having a field inspection, so they would say the band's got to go play for the field inspection for the nurses, and we would then go up and have lunch ahead of all the troops, because they had been out in the field working and they're pretty tired and dirty even at noontime, and the band came up in their nice Class A uniforms, and they said, step aside because the band's got to eat first because they got to do a formation. So then we'd go and play for the nurses and come back and then do practically nothing, write letters or whatever. And then we went and played retreat, and that was the end of our day. And in between we had band rehearsals and things like that. But we really never did any chores, just never did, except when the colonel went to London for a staff meeting. His adjutant, a lieutenant colonel, despised us, and as soon as the bird colonel left, it was not a pleasant experience then, because the adjutant found a lot of things for the band to do. Was not correct, but that's the way it went.
At some point you had another assignment, though. Was that everybody in the band got assigned to something else as it got closer to was it the Normandy?
Yeah. Well, we were out stationed in Cardiff, South Wales, and they called us one day and told us that we were going on a special assignment, and I believe they broke the band up into units of about 7 or 8 men, and they told us that we were going to sort maps for the Normandy invasion. This was about the first part of May. So they took us to, they called it rec halls. They had rec halls in the Army. It was big buildings they used for recreational facilities like ping pong or whatever thing they could find for the troops. And they put us in there and told us that we would be getting these maps. So the maps would come in big bundles, and they'd have like a shopping list with the name of different organizations on it, some infantry unit, some parachute company or whatever, and what maps that they needed. And we would take these maps and put them in packages and label them, and after they were finished, then they would go back to the combat organizations who were going to use these maps. And we never got out. We couldn't get out of the building, and nobody got in, except the only thing that went out were the maps. And when it came time to eat, someone knocked on the door, and they opened the door a crack and passed the mess kits out. And we had a second lieutenant in charge of these units, and he stood there with a Thompson submachine gun and loaded one into the chamber, and that's the way we were guarded, to see that nobody could come in. They would have been killed if they had come in. And so after we finished sorting these maps, they put us on trucks, took us back to a secured area, and in retrospect, I think it was raining quite a bit, and we just listened to the radio because we couldn't leave. We were in the secured area. We couldn't leave there, and we listened to the radio every day. And finally, this one morning, General Eisenhower came on, and said that the invasion had started. And then I think we kept there about 2 more days. Then they sent us back to our quarters that we had originally been through. And from there, then, I think it was about, 3 weeks or so like that, they finally got us together with this Engineer Regiment, the 360th Engineer Regiment, and put us on a landing craft called LCIs, Landing Craft Infantry, and sent us in. That's when we went into France. And
can you tell me a little bit about that then? What was your first impression upon landing there?
In France?
Mm-hmm.
I think you finally realize that, gee, this isn't really the war. Because we walked along after we got up on the beach, walking along the roads, and it was west of Normandy, more like in Brittany. There were signs on the road, and the skull and crossbones hanging on posts where they had the fencing to keep the farmers' animals in there. It says Achtung Minen, which would meant their attention mines. You don't want to walk in there, because if you do, you're going to step on something. You're not going to come out again. You'll be dead. And we saw for a while. Then we got on trucks and moved into a convoy, and we saw they had a Rommel. I think they called it Rommel's asparagus. They took young saplings about 2 inches in diameter, 3 inches in diameter, about 6 feet long or 8. And they buried them in the earth at an angle so that if gliders came in, it would catch the gliders and tear them to pieces and cause them to crash. And we saw tanks we shot out along the highway. And some of the towns, I can't remember all the towns, there were small villages, and we went through them. They were still kind of smoking, and it didn't smell very good. And I think we went through avalanches, and the one Frenchman said the American flags were hanging all over the windows, and this Frenchman said, if the Germans came through here again, there would be hell to pay. And I think it was just a day or two later, there was a counterattack. And I read the book by Omar Bradley, and sure enough, there was some kind of a counterattack there. And that's when we got into Saint Malo and Saint Servan.
Well, when you first landed in France, what was your job assignment? Why had they put you there?
I don't know. They don't tell you anything. You're never told anything in the Army. They say, here you are, and you say, where are we going? They say, you'll find out when you get there. The first night there, we just dug into some kind of it looked like maybe an orchard, and it was very near a swamp because there was trillions of mosquitoes, and we were just bitten very badly during the night. Some of the fellows couldn't see the next morning because their faces were so swollen from mosquito bites. I think, and put field jackets over our head. We had to dig a slit trench and go to sleep in that thing. The mosquitoes were unbelievably bad. We had to dig a slit trench and go into that. And the next day, I don't think we stayed there more than a day. And we got on these trucks and went into a convoy to go toward our objective, which was Saint Malo. And when the objective there was to remove the beach of mines, and they said that now Saint Malo, there's a few German snipers in town, but don't worry about that. But there was a whole German regiment still in town, and there was a citadel in the bay of Saint Malo that quite a few Germans there, and we were there when they sent out an ultimatum, surrender or else, and the Germans said no. And we saw the bombers came over and bombed the citadel, and it looked like chicken hawks flying over. You could see the bombs falling on the citadel. We only stayed there a couple of days and left. And we heard later on from the Stars and Stripes that the newspaper that the Germans had surrendered, ran up a white flag, and they took them in as prisoners.
Were you in any of the fighting at that point? I'm assuming that you.
Some of the people in the regiment, when they got to the crossroads, the Germans had already zeroed in the crossroads, And when our equipment came through, they had earth augers, like these big things the telephone company uses here. And these big earth augers are over the cab of the truck, and they look like an artillery piece. So as soon as they went through the crossroads, the Germans started firing artillery, and they blew up some of the equipment, and some of the people were killed there. And then later on, they tried to go up and retrieve some of the equipment, and that's when some of the men were killed by snipers up there.
So were you afraid for your own welfare at that time?
Well, yeah, because at that time right about that time we dug into some apple orchard, and that's when the mortars came in, the shelling came in, and you have really no defense against that kind of artillery. And it came in and exploded. We were unloading trucks when it happened, and we ran for the nearest drainage ditch and scared to death because you didn't know what was going to happen. You thought maybe possibly there could be the German troops coming up the road and they would have taken you prisoner. So you're pretty concerned. I know the next day the foxholes, or those trenches we dug, got about a foot deeper though. Nobody said, "I'm not going to need that." But after you get shelled, you dig the things a little bit deeper. Fortunately, nobody in our unit was killed or wounded, but there were other men that did get wounded at that time.
And how long were you there in that area?
Oh, maybe about a week, something like that.
And then what happened?
And I think from there we went to, in that particular, then I think we went to Saint-Servan, which is, Saint-Servan and Saint-Malo are sort of like sister cities, like St. Paul and Minneapolis, up in Minneapolis, St. Paul and whatever. We stayed there in Saint-Servan for about, I don't know, a week or 10 days, something like that. We never stayed any place very long. 2 weeks, 10 days was about the maximum. And from there we went to Brest, France, which at that time was a large German submarine pens there. The Germans had taken over a big hospital unit there, used it to house their troops in, and they had these enormous submarine pens. They just could run the subs into these pens to protect them from Allied bombings. Well, by the time we got there, the town had been taken, and it was a shambles. It was an absolute mess. There was debris, just nothing but destroyed buildings. And I don't know how long we stayed there. I guess maybe 10 days or 2 weeks, something like that.
And what was your assignment there? What were you doing there?
Well, the engineers I suppose they were down there doing their thing on the beaches, removing some of the mines, and that's when they drove their trucks over a mine that was attached to a 200-pound bomb, and they didn't find anything but the transmission of the truck. The men that were in the thing died right then and there.
Were you fighting at this time, or?
The unit that I was in?
Mm-hmm.
No, the band never, we didn't do anything.
So you just went along?
We were just along sort of for the ride, you might say. And when we were in Brest, the colonel said, these people in France experience a lot of hardship. So he said, I think you should have that's when we had a warrant officer then. They finally organized our band and got some rank, and they brought a warrant officer in. And this poor man was a graduate, I think, of either Juilliard or Eastman, and they must have given him the worst band in the United States Army. And this poor man, I swear he didn't have an ulcer. Anyway, he said he thought the band ought to have practice, and the colonel said, blankety blank, Mariani, these men have been playing, they don't need any rehearsal. So we went down to the main gate that night, and they did a formal retreat service with the French and the American flag and the Marseillaise and all that business. And that's about the only thing we did. We unpacked. We not playing. There was no band business going on at that time, so we unpacked our instruments and got all dressed up in our Class A's and went down and played for the retreat that night, and it's the first time I saw people cry.
The other soldiers?
The French.
The French.
It wasn't because we played so badly. It was they were playing their national anthem, which they hadn't heard for a long time.
I see. Can you tell me about one or two of the most memorable experiences during that time? Is there anything that stands out for you?
The only thing that was, it was memorable when the shells came over and we all ran and jumped in a ditch and hoping that nothing more serious than that was going to happen. And then it must have been toward a weekend, they asked who was interested in going to church on this Sunday, and quite a few fellows said they would go to church. So we went to this little French village, don't know what the name of it was, and we got out to go to church. And the people were terrified because the last time troops came in, the Germans executed people in front of the church. So they were pretty apprehensive. And then when we went in for the service, a Catholic Mass, the altar boys saw these GIs in church. And all they did was clown around, which the priest didn't take very lightly. But and then the other thing, by this time, of course, Europe and that area was destruction. And then somebody heard that Colonel Barksdale's birthday was. So they said, what we'll do is the band will go over to the Colonel's quarters that morning and we'll play Happy Birthday. And that is the ultimate in apple polishing. So they did, and the Colonel came out on this little balcony where his quarters were and had a very broad Virginia accent and said, that was the nicest thing anybody has done for me, and as soon as we get to a place where there's street lights, we're going to see that you guys all get a 3-day pass. And they all cheered and yelled like something out of Sergeant Bilko. Let's hear it for the Colonel. Those were memorable.
Did you get any leave at all during this time?
No.
None at all?
No.
How often did you get letters from home or hear from people, family?
Oh, I'd say from my immediate family, maybe a couple times a month or so, whenever the mail would be delivered.
And what were your living conditions like? How was the food, for instance?
Food was passable. It wasn't the greatest, but it was better than the troops on the front line, though. It was okay.
And what probably did you miss the most?
Not being able to make my own decisions. What I didn't, how should I say this? I had no freedom of choice. Somebody always told me what to do, where to go, when to get up, when to go to bed, and that's what I missed, my own freedoms.
Do you recall any humorous things that happened or unusual?
Everything in that band was humorous. The first time I fell out with this band, I asked them what uniform they wore, and they said, wear anything you want to. And I said, seriously? They said, anything you want to. I said, what do you wear? Anything you want to. And that morning in Chester, England, when they fell out to play Reveille, some of the guys had on long john underwear with a raincoat over the top of it. Some of them had fatigues. Some of them had on Class A's. Some of them had overcoats, and they had just with their boots on. It was a ragtag outfit like you couldn't believe. Of course, there was nobody around to look at us. It was pitch black. You couldn't see anything because England was blacked out. And a couple fellows had flashlights in the front row to make sure it didn't stumble into a ditch. Yeah, that was I wouldn't call it humorous, but that was a memorable thing. Or when we played, we'd go occasionally and play for the nurses at the hospital, and the officers would come in for a dance, and they had what they called sumps, because the Germans were having these great incendiary raids with incendiary bombs. So what they did, and the water pipes had been damaged in many instances. So what they did, they had like a swimming pool. They may have been swimming pools, but they just like a big pool, and they filled with water. And if a building was set on fire, they would just throw a hose in this thing and pump the water out onto the burning building. And when we played this at one hospital, we'd always have a truck driver who would take us there in these Army trucks. We took our first break and came back, and this truck driver's in a little room in the back. He's got blankets around him, and he's shaking, and was soaking wet. I said, "Where's your uniform? What happened?" He said, "Well, I had to go to the bathroom, and it pitched back, and I couldn't see anything. So I walked out, and I felt this path, and I followed the path, and I took 2 steps up." And he said the next one I fell in about 8 feet of water. He nearly drowned.
Did you make any really close friendships while you were over there?
I mean, but other GIs, other soldiers, yeah, 2 of them, 2 fellows, and one died here just about 2 years ago. We had been in contact for 45, 50 years, visited once or twice with each other.
What did you think of your officers?
Well, we only had one officer, and he was a warrant officer. And nobody liked him very much. He was a short man. He was only about 5'4", and he spoke down to the troops. He never was very kind to us, and he wanted to be a spit and polish officer, and we felt that he just wasn't a spit and polish type of a fellow. And I don't think he was accepted by the other officers in the regiment. No, we didn't like him very much at all.
And what about your fellow soldiers as a group?
Oh, we got along pretty well together, yeah. It was a great group. We lied and told a lot of stories, and particularly when we were sorting maps, because it only took a couple of hours a day to sort the maps, and if the maps were sorted, we'd sit around, and a couple of fellows had unbelievably wild stories to tell. I think that happens in any army.
What do you think was your greatest achievement at that time? What are you the most proud of?
Oh, I think was just being able to survive and coming home in one piece without being injured.
Do you recall when you heard that your service was ended? Do you
Oh,
remember
yeah.
that day? And
Yeah.
how did you feel?
We were in a tent city. They must call it Camp St. Louis, and this was VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and we heard like the wave goes on in the ballpark. We heard this roaring and yelling coming across like that. No, I'm sorry, let me back up. That was when the war with Japan was over. It was like a wave coming over, and everybody was yelling because we thought, boy, the war in Japan is over. Now we won't have to go to the Pacific, because a lot of men were going to the Pacific. When the war in Europe was over, we knew that it was nice it was over. We were very happy about that. But our thoughts then was, well, it's over here in Europe. Now they're going to put us on some ships and send us to the Pacific. Fortunately, it didn't last that long because it was over in May, June, July, and it was about 2 months later the war in the Pacific was over with the atomic bomb.
And then were you immediately shipped home?
Oh no, they had a point system, and they gave points, so many points for every month overseas, so many months in the Army, so many points for whatever decorations you got, points for being wounded, points for, I think if you were married, you got points for that. I think the highest point was something like 125 or 160 maybe, whatever. They were really high. Those guys have been overseas a long time, so they try to get them home as quick as they could, and that's probably the most equitable way of doing things. They just gave these points out, and I only had about 45 or 46 points. I finally got home in February of 1946.
And then did you go back to school, or did you start working? What did you do then?
When I came home, I thought I better go to school, and because I had a GI Bill, and I could go to college, and the government would pay $65 a month and pay your tuition. So I decided to go to school, and in order for me to get to college, I needed another so many hours in mathematics. So I had to go to Hughes High School to pick up the mathematics for geometry, and then I went to Xavier University.
And you graduated?
Graduated.
How did you get into the Korean War then? Did you enlist?
No. My senior year in college, somebody said, hey, we got this Army band going, and if you sign up for this Army band, you get paid, and you can't get very far on $65 or $70 a month. I think I might have gone to 70 or 75 at that time. You get paid for all your meetings. We only meet once a month. And I thought, well, yeah. And I said, but I don't like this camp. They said, that's old Army. They don't do it anymore. And if you miss so many meetings, they just drop you out. I said, okay. So I signed up for the reserves. Went into the reserves in December of 1949. In October of 1950, they activated this Army band from Cincinnati and sent us out to Fort Leonard Wood. And we stayed out there in Fort Leonard Wood for close to 2 years, I guess it was. And when my reserve time was up, I got out, and they tried to encourage us to sign up for the reserves again, but not many did that.
So you never did get over to Korea?
No.
What do you think was did your time in the military affect the way you feel about the military in general today, or war in general?
Well, and so far as I could think of these young men going over there and these conflicts that seem to be popping up all over the place, I feel so sorry for them, and I feel sorry for the fellows in the reserves that are called back. It disrupts their life. They have maybe married and they're starting a career, but they did accept their reserves, and if you do that, then you got to take the whole package that goes with it. And I don't think they can say, well, I don't think I want to go to active duty. If you sign up for the reserves, then you have to take everything that goes with it. I do feel sorry for the people that get called back in the reserves, and I feel so sorry for these young men. They're over there in Iraq and these other places, and particularly like in Korea. I think it's terrible. That's the thing the price you have to pay for our freedom here. I think our nation has to be strong.
What one thing do you think was the most important thing you learned from your experience at that time?
I don't know if I really have anything that I could say that was that important. When you're that young, it's not even a blip on the scale, the things that you're doing. I wasn't a combat soldier, but I really don't think there was anything that struck me as being that important. I think it gave me a new perspective on life, to look what was in store for me, what I could do, and there were more opportunities to be had than just to come back and start a regular job. That I thought that I had more potential in that.
Is there anything that you would like to add that we have not covered in the interview?
No, I don't think so. The only thing I could think, since my wife is German, and she was born in Germany, and she was only 14 years old when the war was over, and I met her brother. Her brother was a U-boat officer, younger than I. And I also purchased Japanese products like cars and cameras and things like that. I think you have to look back and say you can't maintain this attitude, a grudge attitude, and never forgive. That they had certain things that they had to do, and I think there's a certain forgiveness that you got to respect of these people. I don't know any Japanese, but I know a lot of Germans.
I want to thank you very much, Mr. Luck, for taking this time to come in. It was an honor and a pleasure to interview you. Thank you.
Thanks.